The human tendency to repaint our memories of days gone by into the rosiest version of themselves is the inspiration for our next piece, The Good Old Days Weren't. What's the story?
We have a music event that is sure to leave you out of breath. Breathe out slowly. An all-wind instrument orchestra that does air supply covers will be doing an online virtual event this upcoming Thursday via Zoom.
Another virtual event. Man, what's up with all these Zoom meetings? Remember when everything was face-to-face?
Right. In the good old days, you weren't in a room. You were in an actual room with, like, walls and people.
Exactly. In the good old days, everything was live and in front of us. You could practically smell the lead singer's breath.
That's what I'm saying, man. It was real. And also, when you went out, you didn't even have to lock up or anything. Everything was safe. People took care of each other back in the good old days.
Yeah.
First, we should figure out what is happening right now.
Yeah, guys, everything okay?
Nothing. We're good. We're good.
Don't worry about it.
What is the story behind our yearning for the good old days, especially when faced with adversity in the present? Were we safer? Did people actually take care of each other more than we do now? First, we should figure out when the good old days people refer to actually happened. The answer is, it changes. Research has shown that over the last century, when people yearn for an era that was simpler, safer, and better, they're imagining a time about 4 or 5 decades in the past. A survey conducted recently, in 2023, revealed that 58% of Americans believed the country was better off 50 years ago. Go back to a Gallup poll conducted in 1939, and back then, 62% of Americans thought people were better off during the horse and buggy era. So with this consistent pattern of yearning for the fluctuating era of the good old days in mind, let's boogie back 50 or so years and have a look at the 1970s and early 80s. Were people better off? Was it safer? The answer is no. In the 70s, violent crime was the highest it had ever been in the history of the United States. There was also the Vietnam War raging, which altogether took 58,000 American lives. And in the early part of the decade, it hung the constant threat of being drafted over the heads of men aged 18 to 26. Domestic terrorism in the form of protest bombing was a daily threat. The FBI recorded about 2,500 bombings total during this time, an average of 5 a day, with the deadliest year being 1981, when 11 people were killed. We won't even get into the lack of seatbelts, no laws against drunk driving, and iffy baby equipment. With all this going on, people in the 1970s yearned for the simpler times of the 1950s. Happy Days and Leave It to Beaver reruns were all the rage. Of course, the people that lived in the 1950s grappled with the threat of nuclear annihilation, racial tensions, the Korean War, and Red Scare paranoia. So they idolized the 1920s. But of course, in the 1920s, psychologist John Watson got everyone in a dither about the threat of the disappearance of the American family due to rising divorce rates. Prohibition birthed the rise of organized crime and the mafia. There was a revival of the domestic terrorist group, the Ku Klux Klan. The Victorian age was the good old days to our 1920s friends, a time that, in reality, had people suffering from neurasthenia, a new disease that caused anxiety, impotence, insomnia, headaches, and chronic diarrhea because of the unnatural, fast pace of life brought on by railroads and the telegraph. Are we beginning to see a pattern? The obvious question here is, why are we this way? A big part of it is our brains and thought evolution, the way we're wired. Let's visit our ancestors millions of years ago. The decisions they made carried weighty life or death situations on a daily basis. For example, if they assumed a sound behind them was just the wind rustling some brush and not a predator, it could very well have been the last thought they would ever have. To ensure survival, they always assumed predator. Simply put, assuming the worst will always save you. How our thoughts have evolved from this to the modern day manifests in our tendency to give bad news more attention. Another tendency many of us have when considering the present against the past is what psychologists term rosy retrospection. Rosy retrospection is a cognitive bias that causes us to remember or look at the past more fondly than the present. The good experiences of the past rise to the top of our memories and eclipse the bad. This happens because we survived the past dangers, so they take on less significance in our brain space over time. The current problems we face are ripe with uncertainty, so in the present, we tend to give the bad more weight than the good in our lives. Nostalgia and reminiscing about the past is not a bad thing. It's only when our longings twist our perception of the present and future in ways that are not based in truth and reality. Fear of the future endangers experimentation and innovation, and ultimately, progress. When the bicycle first rolled onto the scene, people feared the riding position would create a generation of hunchbacks. They also feared the saddle seat would make women infertile. Vaccinations, anesthetics, and electricity were all also met with fear and resistance. These are all things that we in the present can see have made our society a better place. And let's go back to the sentiment that often follows the words, "back in the good old days." The belief that people used to take care of each other, but today, not so much. Often we point to a past that shows generations of family members living together as proof that family bonds were stronger back then, that people took care of each other. But data shows that extended family households have never been the norm or the ideal in America. The reason extended family members tended to live with each other was because it was a necessity. During the Great Depression, poverty forced families to share housing, and accounts from people back then described it as stultifying and oppressive. During the war years in the 1940s, generations of family members shared a roof because of lean times and housing shortages. Experts at the time warned of the widespread marital crises that would arise due to generational conflicts between household couples. When prosperity returned in the early 1950s, people couldn't wait to move out on their own. Young couples established single-family homes, flocking to the suburbs at a historically high rate. They couldn't get away from the furrowed, judgmental scowls of their elders fast enough. So while we might reside greater distances away from our parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, this does not mean the bonds keeping the American family together are eroding. In fact, now more than ever before, it's easier to keep in touch with family, and statistics show that we do. With over 90% of American households owning at least one smartphone, tablet, or computer, video telephony programs like FaceTime and Zoom put us all face-to-face with our loved ones at the mere swipe of a finger. Social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram keep us up to date on what everyone, from siblings to second cousins twice removed, are doing on a daily basis. And we like this? And 63% of Americans say they use group chats to stay in touch with family regularly. So even though we may not live as close to our families as in the past, we are very much involved in their lives. The fact is, even though the ways in which we take care of each other may look different than it did in the past, we still do have each other's backs when it comes down to it. In this way, American behavior has remained consistent. We have an excellent record of jumping in and helping each other in tough times throughout history. We saw this during the Civil War, when thousands of women served as nurses and volunteers to treat wounded soldiers on both sides. We saw it when a devastating flood hit Johnston, Pennsylvania in 1889, and Americans from all over the country donated, and kept donating for months and months. All total, an estimated 17 million pounds of food and necessities. And in the current day, just look at some statistics around crowdfunding and social media platform fundraising. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the CDC Foundation, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's charitable division, launched Crush COVID-19, a crowdfunding campaign to help raise money for health equity, frontline worker support, and health protection marketing. Through the kindness of the crowd, the campaign raised over $50 million. Another example is #GivingTuesday, a social media fundraising campaign created as a charitable happening that follows Black Friday and Cyber Monday. In 2023, 34 million Americans participated and donated over $3.1 billion. To conclude, it is a very natural practice to sometimes pine for the past, but it's also important to keep in mind that the good old days is a relative term. What might have been good for some people was undoubtedly terrible for others. Every era in human history has faced or will face challenges that are threatening, unjust, and tragic. At the same time, we also experience happenings that are inspiring, rewarding, and life-affirming. This is the shared human experience. Thank you for joining us on The Local Scene. We hope you enjoy the moment you have in front of you and embrace today as being one of the good old days. If you enjoyed this video by The Local Scene, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching.